Hey there, everyone. Welcome to The Great Retention with Camber Parker, sponsored by the YoProKnow. I'm Camber, your young professional expert and founder of the YoProKnow, where we bring you the answers you need to know about how to hire and retain the best talent, starting with the young professionals you work with. There's a lot of young professional fish in the sea, but how do you catch them? And what do you do once you reel them in? That's where we come in. Today, I am excited to have Steve Hall join us, Vice President at Find Great People, or FGP, in Greenville, South Carolina. While Steve and I only connected recently, I knew he had to join me on the show because he gets it. It meaning young professional talent and the impact it will have on our workforce for years to come. Steve and I were connected through mutual business connections after I shared I was looking to build a relationship with the FGP office because of just their reputation in town. I knew it was a good place to get plugged in. And I realized that their recruiting and consulting efforts really shined in the talent space. So I knew that forming a partnership with them eventually was going to be the right move. And that's why he ended up being here today. So having spent the last 34 years with Find Great People, Steve knows a thing or two about talent, which is why he's joining us today. Steve, thanks for being on the show.
Thank you, and what a privilege to be with you and on this topic. I know it's near and dear to your heart, and it certainly interfaces with all of the rest of us in our lives, so thank you for having me.
Absolutely. So we're going to do what I like to call a lightning round to get things started. So kind of short and sweet answers. But first, just give us a little bit more background on you. So personal and professional that we might not have touched on in the intro.
Okay. Well, let me see. Concise.
Yes.
I'll mention the town of Pittsburgh, the college, Bob Jones University, the numbers 32, 34, and 2. Okay. So born and raised in Pittsburgh. Moved here when I was 7, back in the early 1970s to Greenville. So I've seen a lot of change. And then with regard to college, I went to Bob Jones University and graduated there with a bachelor's in marketing and sales management. And then 32, so that's the number of years that my wife Kim and I have been married.
Congratulations.
And thank you. Started dating in high school and have not looked back. 34, as you mentioned, total time that I have been employed by Find Great People because it started when I was a college student. And then the number 2, that's how many dogs we have. We are not blessed with children, but we are blessed with dogs.
Lovely. That was very concise and perfect because I think it really sums up, obviously, the things that are really important to you in your life. Thank you for telling me about both personal and professional. I love that.
You bet.
Tell me what's your favorite productivity tool? I always like asking my guests.
Yeah, so this one was a bit challenging because maybe just because of my generation, but the best answer I can give you is what do I spend the majority of my time keeping myself efficient and also on time, and that's my calendar. So back in my younger days, we had manual planners, and I'm so grateful that we have Outlook or things like that. So I live and die by that, especially given the role that I play at our firm.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I love a good digital calendar, but I still have my paper planner, and I love that thing. So no shame on that. Can you share something that you learned as a young professional, and how did it shape your career?
Well, there are many things, but one thing in particular stands out, given that we're talking about a younger generation and the workforce is changing. As I mentioned, I started at Find Great People as a college student. But that was back in an era in the 1980s where you didn't hire students right out of college into this profession, frankly, not into too many professions. And so I can remember going to conferences to be better at what we were and be the only young professional for years until it started to catch up. Nowadays, we look for talent right out of college in our industry. So real quick story, because of the fact that it wasn't perceived as a welcome in terms of, hey, you're young and don't know anyone and don't know anything, our founder was famous for saying, be a lifelong learner. And so I took that to heart, and I can remember packing my bag lunches before I got married. And every day at lunch, where I didn't have an appointment, I was watching videotapes, the old 8 tracks, that were at my disposal on a little cassette player, TV, if you will. And that is how I tried to improve to be better than the majority of the people in my firm who were all very much older. In fact, in some cases, my parents' age.
Yeah.
So I can tell you that I felt that struggle of being young and not easily embraced. And I felt like I had to work harder.
I love that story. Thank you. I mean, being a lifelong learner is applicable to, every generation. It doesn't matter if you start young or if you start in your middle of your career, but it does kind of give you a leg up when you can do it right off the bat in your career, I think.
That's correct.
So tell us a little bit more about Find Great People before we really dive into the depth of our conversation today.
Thank you for that. Real brief, we do three things. We find talent. We help organizations develop and retain talent through our consulting division. And unfortunately or fortunately, there are times where talent needs to depart. So we transition talent. So the finding part of our business is what we're probably known for over time, which is recruitment generally. And the development and retention is all about human resource consulting, as well as executive coaching and leadership development. And then the transitioning component is when you do have team members that you feel like the job no longer is needed, and we'd rather do something more compassionate than just simply let them go.
Right.
And we can be hired to help with that process.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. And for those who are listening or watching that maybe are not based here, you guys do have offices in several locations, correct? And you're working not just in Greenville.
That is correct. We were founded here in Greenville in 1982, so we hit 40 years in the past few months. 110 of us in the firm now. Small office in Nashville, Tennessee. A bigger office in Columbia, South Carolina. And then the majority of us are at corporate here in Greenville.
Right.
And then newsflash, we will be launching a new office in Charleston.
Very exciting.
We hope by April 1st.
Okay.
So we already have feet on the ground. They're just working remote.
Great.
But we have done work with clients in 46 of the United States and in 14 countries. So
Very cool.
pretty significant.
Awesome. Well, now people can really see why I wanted to have you here because, again, you know a thing or two about talent, and that's really what we're going to dive into now. So basically, the biggest part of today that I really want to cover is we're talking about Gen Z, we're talking about millennials. Millennials, they make up most of the young professional workforce right now, but Gen Z are following at our heels, and there's about 5 or 6 years worth of these 20-somethings that are now in the workplace, and even some who are jumping in straight from high school into the workplace. So these two generations are going to make up about 2/3 of the workforce by 2030. Help us set the stage today by talking about this from a recruiting and staffing lens.
Well, I think 2 words, labor shortage. That should tell you something right there. In fact, January's numbers came out just a couple of hours ago, and I was doing some reading on that. Way more jobs created than what had been predicted, about 517,000. So that's pretty significant.
Wow.
You'd have to go back to June of last year to have anything close to that. So not what was expected. What does that mean? Well, that means that we actually have more jobs continuing to be open than we have, for example, unemployed. So we've got about 11 million jobs open and roughly 5.5 to 6 million unemployed. So I'll just suffice to say, you and I both have a job, but there are 2 jobs available for us.
Right.
And so that just puts a difficult lens in terms of what we're facing going forward. So labor shortage, in my mind, is the question is, well, why? And so I've been saying for quite a while that this is both a demographic issue and an economic issue. It became an economic issue really in the last year because of inflation. So there's really pressure being put on organizations in terms of their actual business and what they can sell. Prices are rising. And so now they're having to look at every employee with some scrutiny to say, do we need this role anymore? At the very same time, the demographic issue You and I were talking about facts earlier before we came on air. The facts are there's a gap between my generation, Gen X, and the baby boom, my parents, about 4 million births less. Well, we don't catch that up, in fact, until we get to your generation, millennials. And depending on what numbers you look at, you're the larger population compared to the baby boom folks. And then you have the Gen Zs that are right behind you. So this wave is coming, and that's where you're getting your 2/3 in 2030 that's approaching, maybe even higher, depending on who you talk to. So we've got a demographic issue. It's leading to the job shortage. And then on top of that, the pandemic really caused a retraction in hiring. So as a result of that, I'll just shorten this to say organizations have to be not only paying attention to their front door, that's the attraction component, and that's where most organizations spend their time. They have to also be paying attention to the back door. And what I find frequently is that the back door is cracked, if not partially ajarred. And while they're focusing on pulling people in, they are doing not so great a job of keeping them. And so all of this is in the swimming pool,
Right.
and it's making this difficult. And then the question is, with your wave of volume coming in millennials and Zs, do we just simply attract you and keep you the same way that we did with my generation? And the answer is going to be no.
Right. Thank you. I mean, I have a lot of follow-ups to that because you just threw a lot at us, and thank you for that, because that's why we had you. And it's interesting that, of course, we scheduled this interview the day of all of this information being released. So thanks for coming prepared for that too.
Yeah.
A couple of things that I wanted to mention based on your response. So one of the reasons that we're seeing a lot of these openings in jobs, you shared, of course, already based on demographics and economics that we talked about. But something else that's happening is these new opportunities, right? The gig economy is here.
Right.
Nano influencers. We just released an episode this week actually on the rise of the nano influencer and how young professionals now can make money on YouTube and social media. And there's just, it goes into that stat of all these new jobs being created. But can you talk to that point at all about these new opportunities that are coming and how these young professionals are going there instead of some of the more traditional roles?
Okay, so I don't know if it's as much a theory of my own or it's factual because I don't have any evidence to back it up. But my observations are, because you're talking about the traditional job model versus, I'll just call it the creative job model, which is very entrepreneurial in how it looks and how it feels. It appears to me that the millennial generation, and certainly those that are in that midway to younger end of the millennials. I have a colleague, and she referred to herself the other day as an elder millennial.
Yeah.
And she named her age, and so that helped me understand. But she's, it's a family of 4. She's got kids in school. All of a sudden, the freedom and the independence that would have once been characterized for her as a millennial has sort of taken a sideways step because she's got obligations.
Yeah.
So what I'm observing is that the millennial generation, they are drawn to not just one career, but multiple careers because technology allows them to do that.
Yeah.
I read a statistic here recently, though, that caught my attention, and that is that millennials in particular, broad category, so not trying to hone in on any one particular segment of that population, they have the opportunity to make a lot of money, but they're really not making more money.
Correct.
In fact, many, it said in the article by Gallup, they're just actually covering their expenses month to month. So that's intriguing to me. If you have all these other side hustles that you could be doing, why aren't you rolling in the dough? And some are, obviously. But then when you get to your younger mates, the Gen Zs, they're not seemingly at the moment being driven quite as much in that direction. And so this change between a free spirit, entrepreneurial independence, which I think the millennials, they capture that.
Yeah.
Work remote, leave me alone, let me just perform.
Yeah.
we're seeing even in our own company with the Gen Zs that we've hired, they actually prefer to be in the office. They want a relationship. They want a not just one relationship, they want to build relationships across the organization, not just necessarily by department. And so that is interesting to me, that their values, they're similar, but yet they're different.
And we'll talk a little bit more about that later, because I want to circle back on Gen Z wanting to be in the office, because I think, again, it's generally speaking, a lot of the young professionals that are Gen Z that I've researched and studied, they all want that flexibility, right?
True.
So do they still want flexibility?
They still do.
Okay, just wanted to make sure.
It's not a we're ready to come in every day.
Right.
They want the hybrid model.
Right.
But they don't want to be 100% remote in general.
Yeah,
there
absolutely.
are some who would.
Yeah, some, of course. But I think they really do want that connection, especially because most of them have not even had that ever. They've never had a work experience where it was 100% in office. So I know I digressed a little bit, but we'll bring it back and talk a little bit about the recruiting trends that you're seeing for this year, because I think that's a question a lot of business owners who might be listening want to know the answers to.
I can just tell you personally, it is overwhelming. I could read for hours and hours, day after day, and find some new twist, right? So let me throw some terms out to you. So you would know about the Great Resignation of 2021, highest volume of voluntary resignations in our workforce in our country's history. So you have that as a data point. Then you get to quiet quitting, right? More recent in the last year. And that simply, for those who don't know, that is the notion, I have a job, I'm going to keep my job, but I am only going to do the minimum of that job. Don't ask me to stay late. Don't ask me to come early. Don't ask me to work late. And so as long as you'll keep me, I'll just work sort of at a bare minimum pace. And then I just discovered a new term, quiet hiring, which I hadn't heard of yet. And so what is that? Well, apparently it's the reverse, and it's all the other people who would say, hey, if you'll pay me more, I'll do the extra work. I'll stay late. I'll come in early. I want more responsibility. Just pay me for that. And so that threw me for a tailspin. And then mix into that, due to the economic changes with inflation. We've heard about the very public recent tech layoffs, right? It's actually a fraction of the overall total workforce population. So keep that in mind. But this idea of the great hesitation, it's like, well, what is that? Well, that's on the employer side. And that's basically companies like us saying, hey, it's so hard to find you when we do find you. We don't want to just reduce your position or get rid of it. I'm going to hang on to that position as long as I possibly can. And so there is the employer's side of this, which is I'm reluctant to lay anybody off because I don't know where this is going to go. And of course, anecdotally, in our own firm, we've seen a shift from October, November, December, a reduction in our request for talent, significant enough that it shocked us. And then January, here we are, we're back to some of the pace that we were experiencing at the height of 2022. So all of a sudden, it seems like, what inflation?
Right.
So there's a whole lot of this going on, which makes the recruiting component more challenging. And I would just say, even if there are more layoffs to come, it's selective reductions versus selective recruitment.
Right.
There's still going to be the need to hire, even though there may be the need to selectively let some people go, depending on your business model.
Yeah. I think, thank you for describing a lot of those terms, because I think a lot of people who are listening are definitely, we're thrown these terms day in and day out. And so it's nice to have it all in one place. So that was very helpful. But can you tell us a little bit, because of these people that are watching and listening, they are always looking for proactive ways to recruit, even if they might be, selectively reducing and what did you say? And selectively versus selectively recruiting right now.
Yeah.
When they are looking to attract talent, what are the things that young professional talent that you're seeing through the recruiting lens, what are they looking for? What's gonna make them stay or leave?
It's funny. I feel like I should ask you that question because that's your station in life.
It is,
However,
but I want to see based on. I mean, you work with a lot more companies, right? You're a bigger company, and so that's very nice of you to say. But that's why I want you here, and I would love to hear your perspective based on your expertise.
So I'll mention two terms that I'm sure you're very familiar with. You've got brand promise, and so from all the research that's being done and continuing to be being done, but also just practicality in the workforce. The younger generations, they want you to actually live out what you say.
Yeah.
So whether it's on the consumer spending side, again, most of the millennial and Gen Zs, they're buying online versus in my case, I prefer to go and meet somebody face to face at a shop, right? I can still do the online. It's not that I won't. It's just what I'm comfortable with.
Of course.
So that brand promise of whatever you're telling us your company is for, that needs to be lived out consistently across every channel of your social connectivity.
Yeah.
And then you couple that with employer branding. So who are we and what do we stand for? But then that has to match with the reality of how they live in terms of a culture day to day.
Yeah.
And so what we are seeing is that if you are an organization that markets yourself as this, but you actually live like this, the two generations that we're speaking of, they will very quickly decide this isn't what I signed up for, and they'll exit very quickly.
Yeah.
My generation X, very different view. We might not see it the same way. I'm going to work until you cross a line that really crosses a line with my values, but I'm going to give you plenty of loyalty time. And that isn't so with the younger population and generations. And so I do think that companies, they can't just simply attract. They really have to work on that retention component.
Absolutely.
And why would you stay more than 2 years? Because the stigma is 2 years or less.
Right.
Millennial and Z, they're gone.
Right.
I don't think that they have to be gone. I think they want to stay. But are we giving them reasons to stay?
Yeah.
And so I do think that that's where organizations still haven't caught on.
Yeah, I'm so glad you said that. I mean, that was one of the first things I think that really engaged me when we spoke was you said those very things. And that's something I've learned talking to all these companies recently in the last couple of years. There's not a good consistency between the two, and they have to be connected. They can't be siloed. And so I really appreciate you mentioning that. And just for everyone listening and watching, those do check out. I know you said that you should have been asking me that question, but that checks out. So thanks for sharing. Yeah. And because you have worked with so many young professionals over the course of your 34 years, right, at FGP, what are these, tell me a little bit more about the key findings. So we know we talked about the brand promise. We know we talked about practicality, living out what you say, but talk a little bit more about the other components, the culture, the professional development opportunities, education, communication. We haven't really talked too much about communication, but what are you finding that these younger professionals want when it comes to those respects? Okay,
so I feel like that really goes more to the retention side of this discussion. Because you can advertise it, but again, we're back to you have to live it, and it has to be a reality. Yeah. So based on what we have seen so far in for sure the millennial, but also in the few Zs that are coming along, flexibility. So we already know this from COVID, right?
Right.
Well, here's an interesting factoid, and you can check this on me and report back if I've got it wrong. But I was really kind of blown away when I heard a stat a few months ago. The majority of the workforce, the majority of the country is not working remote.
Yeah.
But that's how it feels because that's what we hear about on the news and through other social channels. That being said, we had to go to a remote based on the pandemic. So now the conundrum for leaders is, what do we do?
Yeah.
Because in many people's views, we're beyond the stage of being terribly concerned about this from a pandemic perspective. So I would just say proximity versus productivity. And so I think the hybrid model is actually here to stay. I'm not so sure the remote 100% is forever entrenched. I think in certain roles and in certain types of industries it is. But as a broad general category, I think hybrid is probably what's here to stay.
Yeah.
And that's a 2-day out, 3-day in kind of typical concept. And oh, by the way, if your productivity is not where it should be, we're going to ask you to come in the office an extra day or 2 extra days until we get that formula correct on the performance. The other thing is purpose. So building community outside of just we work together. And so it was interesting. I was talking to an executive this morning over coffee. We actually were talking about this subject among other topics. And he was just talking about how they were creating collaborative opportunities beyond the workplace, in particular for Millennial and Gen Z. Of course, those of us at the later stages were welcome to join, but it might involve bowling nights out. It might involve, and it will involve most likely volunteer opportunities to collaboratively work together to give back to our community. And so being very intentional on how we connect, not just during the 8 hours of the day, but after that. So an example in our own firm, I've heard about this. They didn't invite Uncle Steve into this situation. I'm in a different department, so that's probably why. But there's a pretty large group of our firm, and that's mostly Millennial and Gen Z, and they're doing a health wellness challenge.
Great.
And so they've structured some way for them to participate in exercise and other things that they're having a contest. And this is a multi-week or multi-month, I'm not sure. So purpose. And then culture and authentic communication, just very briefly. Culture is such a vague word. And how do you actually define that? And I would just say from our company's perspective, our values, do they align with our behaviors? So that goes back to that employee branding or even brand promise. Are we living out what we say are valuable to us? And then on authentic communication, that's a favorite of mine, and I've talked about it for years. The ability that if I hear something that doesn't square with me, and I heard somebody else said it or did it, rather than talking with yet another person about it, I actually say, hold on, did you say this the other day in reference to me? I just want to understand. So it requires a seeking to understand, but then it requires respectful communication. And unfortunately, in our social, our communication into all the social forms, it is really about reactivity because it's not spoken communication, it's written. It's tweets, it's posts. And so therefore I can actually put you down. So if we focus on the spoken communication, I should be more respectful. And so now I build a culture of authenticity as a result of that.
Yeah, well, thank you. That was a really well laid out answer. So thank you for touching on all of those really important points. I don't know how the time has already passed. This is what always happens in these episodes. But just to wrap things up, Steve, tell us, we know that there's some challenges right now. We've talked, at length about that today. But because of the Gen X and Boomer generations that are leaving the workforce at rapid rates, talk about what that means for these younger professionals that are going to be filling these leadership positions, and then we'll wrap up the interview today.
Okay, so first thing that comes to mind is back to that productivity and proximity model, where it's a bit at odds with one another, and that is just how do we measure performance in that kind of hybrid or remote environment? How do we track and measure? I'm not sure that too many people have figured that out entirely yet. A big thing in my view is knowledge transfer. So enough of us in the two categories that you mentioned are either close to, have already retired, thinking about it in the next 10 years. But especially with the COVID and the remote, it's really more difficult during those few years to be able to just walk down the hall, situational mentorship, handing off experiences and knowledge, asking, hey, how would you have handled that? If I have to schedule a Zoom call with you to figure that out, I'm losing that efficiency.
Yeah.
So that to me is a problem. If it stays in the 100% remote category, hybrid I think can solve that. And then the last thing I would just say, my generation, we were basically forced to endure hardship and come out on the other side of it. We didn't quit a job because we had difficulty. We stuck it out and had to work through it. So a challenge that I see potentially with your peer group is because of the turnover rate that is statistically true. I just would love to see them stick out difficult circumstances where it's less about their preference and more about learning. And the reason I say that is because in a few years' time, there's going to be so many of you in leadership roles. You're going to need to pull out of that catalog of memory how this was handled.
Right.
And that's what my generation and my parents' generation really can do because they stuck with it, they endured. And so that's a challenge that I wonder if it will get resolved. But I'm just say I'm nervous about what I see currently, and I hope that changes.
Yeah, well, thank you for being honest. And I think we could be here for another hour just talking about that. But only time will tell, and we have a lot of people working in this space. So I'm hopeful, part of the younger generation. Steve, thanks so much for joining us. It's been a pleasure having you on the show.
Thank you very much.
Thank you again for joining us on The Great Retention with Camber Parker. Before you go, remember this. Young professionals make up nearly half of the workforce today and are expected to jump at a rapid pace in this next decade. What will you do to help them become the great leaders we need for our future? Join us next time for more information on how to recruit and retain young professionals. And if you enjoyed this episode, please leave us a rating on Apple Podcast or wherever you listen to your podcast. This helps others know where to find episodes on this topic. And don't forget to share with your coworkers. Thanks again, and we'll see you next time.